Story 1. I've been awake for 18 days. I'm not exaggerating. I've really gone all this time without any sleep or rest, not even a little. The strangest part is that I don't feel tired. These last few days have been the craziest of my life, and I think it's going to get even worse. It all started the night before one of my exams. Finals week had come, and even though I had studied all month, the pressure was still intense. Having so much of my grade depend on one test always made me nervous. I'd been lying in bed for 3 hours, unable to sleep. It was 4 a.m., and my exam was at 8. I decided to get out of bed and study more. Pulling an all-nighter seemed better than sleeping for a couple of hours and then waking up tired. So I got out of bed, got dressed, and went outside. The air was warm and humid. The campus library was open, as it always was during finals week. Inside, it was very quiet. The person at the information desk stared blankly at the screen, not noticing me at all. There were a few other students around, looking like zombies, with cups of coffee in one hand and laptops in the other. In the center of the main lobby, there was a table with a white cloth. On it were 2 big coffee dispensers and a basket of paper cups, along with creams, sugars, and sweeteners. The school offered free coffee during finals week to help students stay awake. I don't usually drink coffee because I don't like the taste, but it was 4 a.m. and I needed to stay awake. So I filled a cup and added a lot of cream to make it more drinkable. Then I went upstairs to the computer lab, logged into a computer, and started reviewing my professor's PowerPoint presentation. I drank the coffee quickly. It tasted as expected, but the texture was strange, like tiny balls in the liquid, almost like cottage cheese, but less noticeable. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was something I had added to the coffee or a quirk of the brand. The cup looked normal, so I forgot about it. About 10 minutes later, the caffeine hit me hard. My heart was pounding, and I felt wide awake, as if I had just slept for 10 hours. There was a joke at the school that the coffee was spiked with jet fuel, and now I knew why. Looking back, I'm glad I didn't have more coffee. I might have had a heart attack. I continued studying until about 7 a.m., when the sun began to rise. As I left the library and stepped into the cool morning air, I still felt great, even though my heart was racing from the caffeine. For the first time, I understood why people loved coffee. It made me think that maybe I should drink it more often, but by 2 p.m., the caffeine had worn off, and I crashed. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, and I was suddenly exhausted. I went back to my bed, hoping to sleep off the previous night, but I had more exams the next day, and my anxiety about them was growing. One exam, in particular, was worth 40% of my grade, and I felt unprepared. The thought of it sent me into a panic. I have mild anxiety, so exams are always more stressful for me. I tossed and turned, unable to calm down. But then, something strange happened. My exhaustion vanished. I blamed it on the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I tried splashing cold water on my face and taking a hot shower, but it didn't help. Hours passed and I still couldn't sleep. It was as if the crash from the caffeine had ended abruptly, since sleep wasn't an option. I decided to keep studying until about 11 p.m. that night. This pattern continued over the next few days. Each night I stayed awake, feeling strangely alert and focused. My energy levels never dipped, and I began to wonder how long this could last. My exams came and went, and I managed to get through them without sleep. Now, after 18 days of sleeplessness, I'm starting to worry about what might happen next. I feel like I'm living in a strange, surreal dream, but I don't know how or when it will end. Every morning I watch the sunrise with an odd sense of calm. I would walk out of the library and feel the cool morning breeze on my face, a stark contrast to the humid night. Even though I hadn't slept, my mind was sharp, and my thoughts were clear. By the time the caffeine wore off each day, I felt the weight of exhaustion hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just physical tiredness. It was like my whole body was demanding sleep. Yet despite lying down and closing my eyes, sleep wouldn't come. It was as if my brain had forgotten how to shut down. The nights were spent in a mix of studying and pacing around my room. I tried everything to tire myself out. Exercise, reading, even meditating, but nothing worked. My body felt fine, but my mind was restless, constantly racing with thoughts about the exams and the future. As the days turned into weeks, my routine became a strange blend of day and night. Time started to blur, and the normal rhythm of sleeping and waking felt like a distant memory. I would study, go to my exams, and then start all over again, never stopping to rest. During one of these long nights, I decided to explore the campus, hoping a walk would help. The campus at night was a different world. It was silent and empty, a stark contrast to the bustling daytime. The only sounds were my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The familiar buildings looked eerie in the moonlight, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. I found myself standing in front of the library again. I thought about the first night when this all started. The coffee, the sudden burst of energy, and the strange texture I felt in the drink. It all seemed so distant now. I walked in and saw the same tired faces at the information desk and the same few students huddled over their laptops. I realized that everyone was in their little world, fighting their battles with finals and sleepless nights, but none of them knew the extent of my struggle. They would eventually go back to their rooms and get some sleep, while I continued to be a prisoner of wakefulness. The 18th day marked a turning point. I no longer felt the difference between day and night. It was all one long, continuous blur. The constant state of alertness became my new normal. I adapted to this strange existence, functioning as if sleep was something I had never needed. Despite this, a part of me worried about the consequences. How long could I go on like this? What was happening to my body and mind? The questions haunted me, but I had no answers. All I knew was that I had to keep going, keep studying, and keep living, even without the rest that every human being needs. The days ahead seemed uncertain, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. This was my new reality, and I had no choice but to face it head on, one sleepless night at a time. I couldn't believe it. I still didn't feel tired. I spent hours tossing and turning, hoping, even begging myself to fall asleep, but it was no use. I had enough. I picked up my phone and searched on Google to see how long caffeine is supposed to last. Most results said 4 to 6 hours, with some saying up to 12 hours, but I had already been awake much longer than that. I told myself that maybe I was just very sensitive to caffeine, and because this was my first real-time drinking coffee, it would take longer for the effects to go away. I thought I would crash eventually and just needed to wait it out. But that didn't happen. It was now 4 a.m., and I was still wide awake in bed, feeling the same. I decided to spend the night studying again, but I made sure not to drink any more coffee this time. I was a bit worried that I might regret not having coffee during my morning exam, but I didn't. Nothing had changed. Now, I was starting to get worried. Did I have a bad reaction to the coffee? What was going on? I called my mum to see what she thought. She was just as concerned and suggested I go to the university's health centre. At the health centre, they suggested I take some medication and see if that helped, and to call a doctor if it didn't. As expected, the medication didn't help. As I lay awake, a cold sweat began to trickle down my skin. It started slowly but became intense, soaking my sheets. My head began to throb with a sharp headache, getting worse with every passing minute, as if someone was drilling into my skull. Along with the headache, I felt a strange tapping sensation in my head, almost like something was moving around inside. It wasn't rhythmic. It moved from one part of my forehead to the other, then around the back of my skull, wrapping itself around my brain. I didn't know what to make of it. That was my breaking point. I decided I would call a doctor the next day. When I did, I was told the earliest appointment was in 2 weeks. I was frustrated but booked the appointment and hoped my condition wouldn't get worse. The next day, my mum nearly gasped when she saw me on FaceTime, saying I looked paler than snow. I had to agree because I suddenly felt extremely nauseous during our conversation. I gagged harder than I ever had, quickly ending the call and rushing to the bathroom to throw up. I sat by the toilet for the next hour, retching, while the headache and strange tapping continued in my brain. To make matters worse, as I was vomiting, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was brief, but it looked like an odd, elongated shape slowly moving up the bathroom wall. I didn't get a good look at it, as it disappeared before I could turn around. I searched the entire apartment from top to bottom, but found nothing. It was like whatever it was had vanished into thin air. That was the last straw for me. I assumed the lack of sleep was causing me to hallucinate, even though I still felt awake. I couldn't wait 2 weeks for an appointment. I had to do something. With no other options, I called 911. The paramedics arrived quickly, and after seeing how bad I looked, they put me on a stretcher and took me to the hospital. The 2-hour wait in the emergency room was miserable. I sat on a hard plastic chair in a brightly lit, sterile room surrounded by other sick patients. My symptoms got worse the entire time I was there. My vision started to get blurry. and I kept seeing something move in my peripheral vision, like back in my apartment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor called me in. He introduced himself as Dr. Jones and asked me some basic questions. "How are you feeling, Kevin?" "Terrible." "Have you taken any drugs recently?" "Other than NyQuil, no." "Do you drink alcohol?" "Very rarely." The questions were standard, but one at the end caught my attention. "Did you drink any caffeinated beverages recently?" the doctor asked. I thought for a moment. "I did have a shot of coffee, but that was 3, maybe 4 days ago." The doctor made a note and said, "Okay, that shouldn't be causing this. I'm not sure what's happening. We're going to run some tests to hopefully find an answer. If we can't find anything, we might have to keep you overnight for a sleep test." I almost laughed at the idea of a sleep test, but the preliminary tests went as expected. They took blood samples, checked my blood pressure, and monitored my heart rate. Everything came back normal. My vitals were perfect, which was frustrating because it meant there was no clear cause for my symptoms. Since they couldn't find anything, they decided to do a sleep study that night. They took me to a room that looked more like a hotel room than a hospital room. It had a big window that let in natural light, a blurred-out window on the side, and a neat old-fashioned lamp on the nightstand. The bed looked cozy with a lovely wooden headboard. If I weren't feeling so awful, I would have appreciated it more. They hooked me up to various machines to monitor me while I slept. Dr. Jones said, "You're all set up, Kevin. Don't worry. We'll be watching from the adjacent room all night. If you need anything, just ask." I nodded weakly and watched as he handed me a couple of pills. "Here's some Tylenol for the night. It's stronger than what you took before. Hopefully, it will help." I took the pills, hoping they would finally let me sleep. After I took the pill that the doctor gave me, he quietly left the room, turning off the lights and closing the door behind him. The room was enveloped in complete darkness, with only the soft hum of the surrounding machinery breaking the oppressive silence. My eyes hadn't yet adjusted to the dark, so I couldn't see anything at all. I laid my head back on the pillow and closed my eyes, hoping that I'd drift off to sleep. The bed was incredibly comfortable. Normally, I would have fallen asleep almost instantly in such a cozy spot. But instead, time seemed to crawl by, painfully slowly. An hour passed, then another, and frustration started to build inside me. The pill the doctor had given me didn't seem to be helping at all. I lay there with my eyes shut, staring into the void, but sleep wouldn't come. Midnight came and went, and with it the throbbing in my head returned, more intense than before. The gentle tapping sensation I had felt earlier turned into a relentless pounding that seemed to spread across my entire brain. It was as if I could hear it inside my head, like the sound of crumpling paper. I shot up into a sitting position, clutching my face in pain. By this time, my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I could see the shadowy outlines of the room. The nausea came back with a vengeance, and stars flickered in my vision. Then I heard a noise coming from the dark corner to my left, a smooth, slow sound climbing up the wall. I turned my head towards the noise and saw something that made my heart race. In the corner where the left and back walls met, I saw a long, slim, black shape. As I squinted to see it more clearly, I realized it wasn't just a tube. It had hundreds of tiny legs moving in unison, making it crawl up the wall. The creature continued to climb, seemingly unaware of my presence. Its long, wriggling body moved in perfect harmony as it made its way toward the ceiling. I was frozen with fear for a moment before I sprang out of bed and screamed, knocking over the equipment I was connected to in my panic, causing a loud crash. The doctors rushed into the room, turning on the lights and demanding to know what had happened. I was hysterical, my head still pounding painfully. "There's something in the corner!" I shouted, pointing to where I had seen the creature, but when I looked again, it was gone. Dr. Jones looked at me with concern and asked how long I had been awake. He explained that severe sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. Even though it made sense, what I had seen felt so real. The doctors decided to cancel the sleep test because I had broken the equipment. They said they would review the data they had collected so far and moved me to a regular hospital room to wait for the results. As they were moving me, I felt a wave of nausea and started to gag, eventually vomiting on the floor. The doctors were briefly taken aback but quickly helped me into the hallway. I didn't see what happened to the mess I had made. In my new hospital bed, I checked my phone and saw numerous worried messages from my mother. I called her, and she nearly cried when she saw I was in the hospital. I told her everything that had happened. From the sudden wave of nausea to calling 911 and the sleep test. She decided to fly down to visit me as soon as possible. Despite everything, it was comforting to know I would see her soon. Dr. Jones came back and showed me the data from the sleep test. He pointed out that my brain waves were highly irregular and very active, especially during the episode I had experienced. He said I needed a head CT scan as soon as possible and left to arrange it. I could barely manage to say okay before he left. Finally, I broke down. This entire situation felt like a nightmare. I just wanted it to end. I wanted to sleep and stop seeing that creature in the corner of my eye. A few hours later, Dr. Jones returned and took me to the head examination room. The room was small and white, with a control desk and a large, noisy machine that looked like an MRI. I lay down on the bed and was wheeled into the machine. Even though I knew it was a routine, painless procedure, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. All I could do was hope that the scan would provide some answers and relief from this terrifying ordeal. Dr. Jones and the team went back to the control area near the entrance and told me the scan was about to start. But just a few seconds later, there seemed to be a problem, and one of the assistants ran out of the room in a hurry. My heart started to beat faster. Dr. Jones came to me right away with a serious look on his face. "Listen, Kevin," he said with a sigh. "Normally, it takes weeks to get CT scan results, but we've seen some things here that we need to take care of immediately." He took me to the area where he had been during the scan and pointed at the computer screen. I almost gasped when I saw the image on the screen. The picture showed my head, which was normal, but there was something else. Wrapped around my brain was a long, bug-like creature with two big antennas at the front and countless legs. It looked like a giant millipede, but it was a bit fatter and long enough to go around my brain twice. It was the same creature I had seen in my hallucinations, just a bit smaller. I felt my heart pound in my chest as I stared at the disturbing image. I felt sick, but not because of illness this time. "What the heck?" I exclaimed. "Yeah, Doctor," Jones said. "I don't know where this came from. I've never seen anything like it before, but we need to get it out of you quickly." I nodded, still lost in my thoughts. This thing had been inside me for who knows how long. Was it what I felt when I experienced that tapping inside my head? Was it crawling around in there? As if on cue, it started again. I paid closer attention this time, and I could feel it. All those little legs moving along my brain. I panicked, and that only seemed to make it move faster. It almost seemed excited or stimulated in some way. My headache came back, and I fell to the ground, my fear momentarily forgotten. Dr. Jones helped me up and looked at me with concern. "Look, Kevin, I'll try to schedule surgery to remove it as soon as possible. Until then, just try not to think about it too much. Okay? Not think about it too much." That was easier said than done. How was I supposed to go back to my room and pretend like nothing had happened? My fear got worse as I went back to my room. I could still feel it. It had been active recently and my symptoms were getting worse. As soon as I got back, I rushed to the bathroom. The stuff I threw up looked the same as before, full of those weird black spheres. I didn't pay attention to it, though. I was still thinking about that thing. It was real. Maybe my visions hadn't been, but whatever that was, it had been living inside me the whole time. I tried to calm myself down and tell myself it would be out in a day. That didn't help. After finishing in the bathroom, I got up weakly to wash my hands. That's when I saw it. Above my eyebrows, in the middle of my forehead, there was a big bulge. It was still. As I looked closer, I realized it wasn't just a bulge. It was a long, winding, bug-like shape that circled around my entire head. I could even see pieces of my hair moved by its shape, as it was under them. I don't know what came over me, but all my worry and tension disappeared. My right hand moved up to my scalp as if it had a mind of its own. I didn't try to stop it. I was in a trance. My mind was blank as my arm moved up to the bulge. Then I touched it and squeezed it gently. It was soft, like a sponge, but I didn't have time to think about that. It squirmed away, moving out of view behind my head like a bullet. That snapped me out of my trance. I screamed and jumped back, almost hitting my head on the bathroom tiles. I sat there, breathing heavily, almost crying, before I got the courage to look in the mirror again. It was gone. I checked every angle, but it wasn't there anymore. My headache got worse again, and I ran to my bed, curling up in a ball, tears running down my face. I stayed like that for hours. The doctors came in to check on me. After I told them what I saw, they found nothing, but their presence helped calm me down a bit. That night I lay staring at the ceiling. I don't think I would have slept even if I wasn't sick. Nothing else happened, but the image from the CT scan and what happened in the bathroom haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. My mum came the next morning, and I told her everything. She was as scared as I was, but she calmed down a bit when I told her the doctors planned to remove what they were now calling a parasite. My neurosurgeon, with a team of doctors, an assistant, and my anesthesiologist, came in a few minutes later. They said it was time for the surgery and told my mum to wait in the waiting room. We hugged and said goodbye, hoping to see each other again after it was over. "Don't worry, I'll take good care of you," my anesthesiologist reassured me as she prepared the machine. Bright lights came on as the doctors prepared their tools and laid them out on the table next to me. I knew I wouldn't feel any of it, but it still made me nervous to see all the sharp objects they were about to use on me. They put an IV in my arm and hooked me up to machines that monitored my heart rate and blood pressure. I listened to the rhythmic beeping and tried to relax, staring at the bright lights above. "Okay, Kevin," my anesthesiologist said with a smile. "When I put this mask on your face, count down from 10. You'll be asleep before you get to 0. She placed the mask over my nose and I breathed in the chemicals. I started counting in my head. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I reached the end of my 10-second countdown, but I was still awake. I started to worry because nothing around me had changed. I tried to say something or get up to tell the doctors that I was still awake, but I couldn't move. I was completely paralyzed, unable to even wiggle my fingers. My heart beat faster as I looked at the anesthesiologist, who was checking my heart rate and other vital signs. She noticed something was wrong too. "He's awake," she said, sounding confused as she looked at the screens. "Don't start yet. I'm going to increase the dosage." She turned a knob on the machine connected to my mask, and suddenly I felt a stronger surge of the anesthetic being pushed through the tube into my nose. My paralysis got worse, but I still wasn't falling asleep. I began to panic, and the beeping on the monitor beside me got faster. The anesthesiologist started swearing under her breath as she turned the dial up even more, almost to the maximum. But nothing was working. I lay there, awake on the table, unable to do or say anything, while the doctors crowded around me, trying to get me to go under. Suddenly, the lights above me went out, and the room went completely dark. All the medical staff blurred into the sides of my vision, still and unmoving. The sounds of the frantic movement of personnel and the rapid beeping of machinery were replaced with complete silence. I sat there, breathing heavily, and felt that thing start to move again, crawling around my head. I wanted to throw up. It was incredibly disgusting, and it wouldn't stop. After a few minutes, I heard a soft crackling noise from the far end of the room, slowly getting closer. I stared into the darkness in terror as the sound moved up the foot of my bed, changing to tiny taps on plastic. Soon, 2 small antennas became visible, peering through the darkness. A few seconds later, the head of the creature appeared. It was the same creature I had seen on the CT scan, but it looked much larger. It continued to crawl up the end of my bed and slithered down the other side. I tried to get up and run, but the paralysis drug was doing its job. I was still stuck. I could only watch in horror as it slowly crawled onto the bed and up onto my foot, giving me the sensation of hundreds of tiny legs moving up my body. It seemed relaxed, unaffected by my struggles, as it got closer and closer, gently wrapping itself around my limbs. I could see it clearly now. It looked like a massive millipede, but without an exoskeleton. Instead, its body was a pale, fleshy mass with black marks all over it. It reached my stomach and made a straight line for my face. I tried to hold my head back, but it was useless. The back half of the creature had just crossed over the far bed frame. My eyes watered as it crawled over my neck and touched my chin, its long antennas taking up most of my vision. I didn't seem to be wearing my mask anymore. I don't know when it disappeared, but it was gone, giving the creature the chance to reach between my lips with its front legs and slowly pry open my mouth with surprising strength. I tried to turn my head or do something to stop it, but nothing worked. The only movements I made were the spastic twitches of my muscles as I shook like a leaf. Once the creature had opened my mouth just enough, I gagged as it slowly crawled inside. I felt every movement of its tiny legs on my tongue, the fleshy mass rubbing against the roof of my mouth. I wanted to throw up or cough, but for some reason those reflexes weren't working. All I could do was gag over and over as its long, segmented body moved in like a snake shedding its skin. The head reached the back of my throat and started to move up towards the top of my skull. As I watched more and more of its body disappear behind my lips, I heard the sound of more creatures. Smaller ones began to appear at the sides of the bed and crawled towards me. Some went to my face. Others moved across every inch of my body. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I began hyperventilating, looking at the scene in front of me with terror. Each time I looked, there were more and more creatures appearing out of nowhere, exploring every part of me. A pounding headache started, and I felt the original parasite crawling around in my brain faster than ever before. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the nightmare to end. After what felt like forever, the lights above me came back on, and I jumped out of the bed, screaming and flailing my arms. I almost hit the anesthesiologist's hand as she grabbed my shoulders, trying to calm me down. "Easy, easy," she said. I wanted to yell at her, but then I realized everything I had just seen, all those bugs, those creatures, they were gone. It was just me and the doctors in an operating room with a fast beeping heart monitor. I took a second to collect myself and saw the mask sitting on the bedside table. They had taken me off the medication. I collapsed into tears and begged for my mother. When I saw my mum again, I almost tackled her with relief and told her everything about the horrible experience in the operating room. A few minutes later, Dr. Jones came in looking very serious. "Kevin, I'm sorry about what you went through. We're going to try some anti-parasitic medication to see if it helps your condition. Unfortunately, the medical staff is a little lost because you have a parasite we've never seen before. We'll call in some researchers to understand it better." My mum immediately protested. "You are not going to run experiments on my son." Dr. Jones calmly replied, "They aren't experiments, Mum. We just want to study the best way to kill or remove this parasite. Besides, it's Kevin's choice." They both looked at me and I sighed. I wanted this thing out of me as soon as possible, so with nothing left to lose, I agreed. The next 7 days were tough. I had been awake for 13 days by then. Despite feeling horrible, I didn't feel the need to sleep. I felt just as awake as when this whole thing started, and I resigned myself to not feeling sleepy until it was over. I asked to spend my nights with my mum because, after the surgery encounter, I didn't want to be alone at night. Her presence helped calm me, and she even made me laugh about it a little. Over time, my hallucinations became less intense, which the researchers noticed. By then, a team of researchers was watching me 24/7, doing constant tests and scans. The antiparasitics they gave me didn't seem to have any effect, which was expected. One day, a researcher came in with an idea. He noticed my symptoms calmed down when I was relaxed and got worse when I was stressed or scared. He suggested giving me a high dose of medication to regulate my stress hormones. I tried it for 2 days, and the scientists' theories were confirmed. My hallucinations and other symptoms weakened significantly. A CT scan showed the parasite had shrunk a lot. It was starving. The researchers thought the parasite likely fed on stress hormones or other things your body produces when you're stressed. For the next 2 days, they continued this pattern until my symptoms were almost gone. I was still awake, but everything else was minimal. The parasite on the CT scan looked like a shriveled husk. Dr. Jones came in one day and gave me news that almost made my stomach drop. He wanted to try the surgery again since the parasite had become so weak that they didn't think it could overpower the anesthesia again. I hesitated. I wanted to be done with this, but didn't want to relive the experience. Dr. Jones assured me they would start with a low dose of anesthesia, and if it didn't work, they would stop the operation. After a long debate between my mum and the doctors, we decided to go ahead with the surgery. Thankfully, the surgery went smoothly. When I woke up, I saw the parasite that had caused all this trouble. It was dead, lying on the bedside table. It looked the same as in my hallucinations, but smaller. I even got to name it. Neural sleep parasite had a nice ring to it. They took the creature away for further study, and I never saw it again. The doctors explained that I probably ingested its eggs when drinking coffee in the library. The high stress response allowed it to take over my brain for a while. But I cut them off. I didn't want to hear more. I was done. A few hours later, I was released from the hospital. My mum and I got into my car, and I drove back to my apartment. I know I should have let her drive, but I was eager to return to normal life. However, I soon regretted it. The 18 days of no sleep hit me hard during the drive. Without the parasite stimulating my body, I needed sleep again, and my brain was demanding it. I began to doze off at the wheel and drifted into an oncoming lane. My mum's shrill scream woke me up just in time to avoid a collision with a massive truck. I quickly pulled the car back to the proper lane, adrenaline pumping through me. I pulled over and let my mum take the wheel, realizing my mistake. She drove us home the rest of the way. When we arrived at my apartment, I immediately planned to dive into bed and catch up on those lost 18 days of sleep. Or so I thought, because as soon as I got under the covers, my tiredness vanished. I began to panic but forced myself to think clearly. They said I ingested its eggs with that coffee. What if there were more? What if it laid more eggs while inside me? Those odd black spheres coming out of me were unsettling, but I never thought to mention them because there was always something more urgent happening. I'm writing this now with a piercing headache. All my symptoms are coming back. I think I just felt something crawl under my skull. Story 2. I was driving my old, rusty Toyota Corolla. Somehow the speakers still worked, even though everything else about the car seemed to be falling apart. Jess was sitting in the front passenger seat, her feet up on the dashboard, scrolling through her phone. Occasionally, she would smack me on the arm to show me memes, but I couldn't look at them while driving. In the back seat, Kyle, Luke, and Rachel were crammed together. Kyle was holding a styrofoam cup filled with something mysterious. He leaned forward between the seats, always looking like he was about to share some crazy story that would make us laugh. Luke was the quieter one, really into hiking and survival stuff. He was our nature guy, because Jess insisted we needed one. Rachel was the calm and grounded one, keeping us from getting too wild, especially with Jess and Kyle around. The drive wasn't bad at all. The weather was perfect with blue skies and a slight breeze. The road twisted and turned through beautiful landscapes. We passed a few houses, but soon those disappeared, and dense forests surrounded us. By the time we reached the gravel road leading to the camp, it felt like we had entered a forgotten corner of the world. When we finally saw the camp sign, wooden and faded with Black Pine Camp barely visible, we all cheered. I pulled the car into the gravel lot, turned off the engine and got out. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth. For a moment, everything felt perfect. One by one, the car doors slammed shut, the sound echoing and then being swallowed by the surrounding forest. Jess stretched dramatically, groaning. God, I think my legs forgot how to work. Try sitting in the middle seat for 3 hours, Kyle said, tossing his cup into a nearby trash bin. I'm 90% elbows right now. Rachel pulled out a laminated camp map. Okay, the main cabin is just up that path. We'll find the supply closet and, hopefully, coffee. Coffee's the top priority, huh? Luke asked, adjusting his backpack straps. Obviously, you don't want to see me without coffee, Rachel replied with a smile. Black Pine Camp looked like something out of a postcard at first glance. The cabins were rustic but sturdy, arranged in a semicircle around a gravel clearing with a fire pit in the middle. Beyond that, trees stretched as far as we could see, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Kyle broke the silence first. Okay, where's the creepy guy with the hook for a hand? He's late. Shut up, Kyle, Jess said, rolling her eyes. She walked towards the largest cabin, which looked like it had been an old mess hall. This place does have some serious summer camp horror movie vibes. I'm into it. Great, I said. Just the energy we need. Jess summoning Jason Voorhees on day one. I'm just saying, Jess shot back, pushing the door open and peeking inside. If I hear one creepy noise tonight, I'm leaving you all behind. Noted, I said, following her in. The inside smelled like wood and dust, with beams of sunlight cutting through the cracks in the old shutters. There were rows of long wooden tables, most of them covered in cobwebs. Kyle wandered in behind us, kicking at one of the benches. I like this place. Less liking, more cleaning, Rachel said, stepping into the room with a bucket and a mop she'd found in one of the supply sheds. The sooner we clean this place, the sooner we can relax. We spent the next couple of hours splitting up and cleaning different parts of the camp. Luke cleared debris from the fire pit, while Rachel started scrubbing down the mess hall. Kyle and Jess worked on organizing the sleeping cabins, which were just as dusty as the mess hall, but surprisingly intact. I was in charge of unloading the food and gear. As I carried a cooler toward the mess hall, I saw Jess standing in the doorway of one of the cabins, her arms crossed. Hey, she called out. Come look at this. What is it? I asked, setting the cooler down and walking over. She pointed inside the cabin. Tell me this isn't weird. I stepped in and saw it immediately. Hanging from the ceiling was a small bundle of sticks and feathers, tied together with an old piece of string. It looked handmade. Huh, I said, reaching up to touch it. Don't touch it, Jess said, slapping my hand away. Why not? Because it's creepy, and I don't want you activating some ancient curse while I'm here. It's probably just a decoration, I said. Yeah, sure, she said, narrowing her eyes. When I'm gone, you can deal with it. I'm not sleeping here if that thing's still hanging. Before I could respond, Kyle stuck his head in the door. Hey, lovebirds, quit slacking. Luke says the fire pit's ready. We're not slacking, Jess snapped, pushing past him. And I'm not a lovebird. Kyle grinned. Whatever you say. We gathered by the fire pit just as the sun started to set. Luke had set up a circle of old camp chairs, and Rachel had brought out a bag of marshmallows she'd found in our gear. See? Kyle said, holding up a marshmallow on a stick. This is the life. No cell service, no responsibilities. Just us and nature. The fire was dying down when the first strange noise reached us. At first I thought it was just the wind, a low and faint sound. We didn't say anything, too caught up in the moment. Kyle was telling a ridiculous story about a haunted amusement park, waving his arms around like an over-enthusiastic camp counselor. And then the clown's head just... He clapped his hands together. Pops right off. Blood everywhere. Nice, Jess said, throwing a marshmallow at him. Way to kill the vibe. Come on, that was gold, Kyle replied, catching the marshmallow mid-air. You're just mad you don't have my storytelling skills. I think I'm mad that you exist, Jess shot back, laughing. Guys, shh, Rachel interrupted, holding up a hand. Do you hear that? We all froze. For a moment, there was only the crackling of the fire and the occasional chirp of crickets. Then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic mumbling, almost like someone talking to themselves. It was coming from the direction of the wood line, just beyond the clearing. What is that? Luke asked, leaning forward. Wind, I said, though I wasn't sure. No way, Jess muttered, standing up. That's a voice. Someone's out there. Yeah, like a serial killer or something, Kyle joked, though his nervous chuckle gave him away. Rachel shook her head. No, seriously, we need to check this out. What if it's someone who needs help? Or someone who's going to murder us, Kyle added. Jess rolled her eyes and grabbed one of the flashlights. Shut up. We'll never know unless we look. Don't be a baby, Kyle. Reluctantly, we all grabbed whatever makeshift weapons we could find, firewood, long sticks, and followed Jess toward the sound. It grew louder as we neared the edge of the clearing, the mumbling taking on an unsettling rhythm. It was almost hypnotic, rising and falling in a set of odd jitters and cooing. We swept our flashlights around once the noise felt like it was in our ears. That's when we saw her. She was crawling through the dirt, hunched over like some wounded animal. The beam of Luke's flashlight caught her pale, wrinkled skin, and we froze. She was completely naked, her body thin and frail, the bones of her shoulders and hips jutting out like they were trying to escape her skin. Her hair was grey and stringy, hanging in uneven clumps around her face. Jesus Christ, Jess whispered. Is she okay? Does she look okay? Kyle hissed. Rachel took a cautious step forward. Ma'am, are you all right? The woman didn't react. She kept crawling, her hands digging into the dirt as she mumbled to herself. Her voice was low and guttural, the words slurring together in a way that didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard. Ma'am, Rachel tried again, louder this time. Do you need help? Still nothing. Luke swung the flashlight to her face, but she didn't even flinch. Her eyes were wide and glassy, staring blankly ahead as if we weren't even there. Maybe she's deaf, Jess whispered, her voice tight. She's naked, Kyle said, his voice rising slightly. Why the hell is she naked? Stop, Rachel said sharply. She stepped closer, holding her hands out like she was approaching a scared animal. Hey, it's okay. We're not going to hurt you. Can you tell us what's wrong? The woman suddenly stopped crawling, freezing in place. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Then, she slowly turned her head toward Rachel. Holy shit, Jess breathed. The woman's face was pale and sunken, her cheekbones sharp under her paper-thin skin. Her mouth hung open slightly, and for a brief, horrible moment, I thought she might smile. But she didn't. She just stared, her glassy eyes unfocused and empty. Rachel took a step back. Okay, maybe we should... Before she could finish, the woman turned away and began crawling again, dragging herself into the tree line. Ma'am, wait, Rachel called after her, but the woman didn't stop. Her mumbling resumed, louder now, her bony hands clawing at the ground as she disappeared into the darkness. What the heck was that? Kyle said, his voice shaking. I don't know, Luke said, lowering the flashlight. but I don't think we should follow her. Follow her? Jess snapped. Who the heck said anything about following her? Rachel looked like she was about to argue, but then she glanced back at the woods and seemed to think better of it. We can't just leave her out there. She's gone, I said firmly, and whatever's going on with her, it's not something we can deal with. Let's just go back to the cabin and figure this out in the morning. No one argued. We hurried back to the fire pit, leaving the woods behind, but the air felt heavier after that, like the trees were forming a wall around us. By the time we reached the cabin, no one was talking. Inside, we locked the door and sat in silence for a while, listening for any sign of the woman, but the woods outside were silent. Morning came too quickly, dragging with it the kind of exhaustion that no amount of coffee or sunlight could shake. None of us said much at breakfast. The memory of the woman, the way she crawled, the way she looked right through us, hung over the table. Kyle poked at his cold eggs with a plastic fork. So, is no one going to talk about the naked grandma in the woods? Or are we just pretending last night didn't happen? Jess shot him a glare. I think we all saw it, Kyle. You don't have to be an ass about it. I'm just saying, he muttered. That wasn't normal. People don't just do that. She could have been sick, Rachel offered. Maybe she wandered off from somewhere. From where? Luke asked, leaning back in his chair. We're in the middle of nowhere. Closest house is, 20 miles? Guys, can we not? I said, rubbing my temples. Let's just get through today. Maybe she was some random drifter, and she's long gone by now. Jess snorted. Yeah, sure. Long gone. Totally normal behavior to crawl around naked and mumble in the dirt before just taking off. The rest of that day we split up to tackle more of the cleanup, but the air around camp felt different, thicker somehow. It wasn't just the woman, it was everything. The woods, the cabins, even the sky. It was like a strange type of stillness. By mid-morning, I was clearing brush from the trail near the cabins when I found it. A small bundle of sticks, feathers, and animal bones tied together with frayed red string. It was hanging from a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze. What the heck is this? I muttered, staring up at it. Found one too. Luke's voice startled me, and I turned to see him walking up the trail towards me. They're everywhere, he said. I've counted 5 so far. Jess found one tied to the side of a cabin and Rachel's freaking out. I reached up to take the one hanging in front of me, but Luke grabbed my wrist. Don't, he said, his voice low. Just don't touch it. Why? Because it's creepy as heck, that's why. You don't mess with stuff like this. Jess appeared behind him, holding up a bundle in her hand. So what do we do? Just leave them here? Hope the arts and crafts witches don't come back for round 2. She extended out her arm to look at the twigs. I was on your page before. Luke, but these things got to go. We need to tell someone, Rachel said, jogging up the trail to join us. She was pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. These things weren't here yesterday, and I already took down a few with Kyle. Someone's been here. Yeah, no kidding, Jess said. Probably the same someone who was crawling around last night. Stop, I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. We don't know what's going on, but freaking out isn't going to help. Rachel opened her mouth to argue, but before she could say anything, Kyle called out from the direction of the cabins. Guys, you might want to see this. Whoa. We followed his voice to the fire pit, where he was crouched over something on the ground. As we got closer, I saw what he was looking at, a strange symbol etched into the dirt. It was a perfect circle with jagged lines radiating out from the center, almost like a sunburst. It's fresh, Kyle said, tracing the edge of the symbol with his finger. I checked the fire pit last night before bed. This wasn't here. Okay, great, Jess said, throwing her hands up. So now we've got creepy symbols, freaky art projects, and a naked lady crawling around in the woods. Are we sure this isn't some elaborate prank? Like, are there hidden cameras somewhere? If it's a prank, it's a really good one, Luke muttered. Rachel shook her head. I don't think this is a joke. I think we're being warned. Warned about what? Kyle asked, standing up. Rachel didn't answer. She just looked back at the woods, her face pale and worried. The rest of the day was quiet and tense. None of us wanted to go too far from the cabins, but staying close didn't feel much better. Every noise, every shadow in the trees made us nervous. By the time the sun started to set, we were all on edge. The strange symbols, the bundles of sticks, and the heavy silence of the woods, it all felt like it was building up to something. I saw Jess glancing over her shoulder as we walked back to the cabin for dinner. Do you think she's still out there? She asked, whispering. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew the truth. When we finished dinner, if you could call microwaved instant noodles a dinner, The tension in the cabin was thick. Nobody wanted to admit they were scared. But the way Jess kept looking at the windows and how Kyle wouldn't let go of the fire poker showed that we all were. We tried to distract ourselves with a card game, but it didn't help much. Every shuffle of the deck sounded too loud. "Three of a kind," Jess said, slapping her cards on the table. "Pay up, losers." Kyle groaned and flicked a peanut at her. "You're cheating, I know it." "I don't need to cheat to beat you, Kyle," Jess said, smirking, though her eyes darted to the window again. Rachel stood up suddenly, wringing her hands. "I can't do this anymore." "Do what?" Luke asked. "Pretend everything's fine. It's not fine. There's something wrong here. The symbols, the bundles, the woman. This whole place feels off." "Great," Kyle said, tossing his cards on the table. "Let's all panic. That'll totally fix everything." "She's not wrong, though," Jess said, her voice softer. "It's not just her. You all feel it, don't you?" Nobody answered, but the silence was enough. And then something changed. It started faint, just like the night before. Low, rhythmic mumbling, drifting through the trees. My stomach twisted as the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the same as last night. It wasn't one voice this time. It was many. "Tell me that's the wind," Jess said, her voice trembling. "It's not the wind," Luke muttered, already reaching for the flashlight. We crowded by the window, staring out into the dark. The fire pit was barely visible in the faint moonlight, but beyond it, a figure moved. At first it was hard to see, shadows shifting just outside the clearing, but as the mumbling grew louder, the shadows stepped into the open. They were old women. At least they looked like old women. They moved slowly, shuffling in uneven steps, their heads low and their shoulders hunched. The firelight caught their faces, wrinkled, pale and blank, like the woman from the night before. There were 4 of them, all muttering under their breath in that same strange, guttural language. "What the heck?" Kyle whispered, backing away from the window. "Are they—" Rachel started, but her voice broke. "They're old," Jess said, gripping the edge of the table. The women didn't seem to notice us. They shuffled around the fire pit, their muttering rising and falling like some bizarre chant. One of them stopped and tilted her head back, her mouth opening wide as if she was screaming, but no sound came out. "We should go out there," Rachel said suddenly. "Are you crazy?" Jess snapped. "Did you not see what happened last night? We don't go near them." "They're just women," Rachel said, though her voice was shaking. "What if they're lost? What if they're—" "They're not lost," Luke said firmly. "Look at them. Do they look lost to you?" We all turned back to the window. The women had started to move again, this time heading toward the woods. One of them paused at the edge of the trees and turned, staring directly at the cabin. I felt my breath catch. Her eyes were blank and milky, her expression slack, but somehow I felt her looking through the cabin, like she could see us, see me. "Close the curtains," I whispered. Jess moved quickly, pulling the curtains shut and plunging the cabin into darkness. We all stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of our own breathing and the muffled murmurs of the women outside. After what felt like forever, the mumbling began to fade. "They're leaving," Luke said, his voice barely audible. Nobody moved until the forest was silent again. Even then, we stayed huddled together in the center of the room, too afraid to speak. Eventually, Kyle broke the silence. "So, we're all just going to pretend that was normal, right?" "Shut up, Kyle," Jess said, but her voice wavered. None of us slept that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sounded like footsteps. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was over. But deep down, I knew the women would be back. None of us spoke much the next morning either. We sat around the cabin's small dining table, sipping instant coffee and avoiding each other's eyes. The daylight felt weaker than it should have, like the sun was trying to push through some hidden barrier. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see one of those women standing in the clearing. "We have to leave," Rachel said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was hoarse, her face pale. "Today, right now." Jess nodded, barely touching her coffee. "Yeah, this place is messed up. I don't care if the camp leader gets mad. We're leaving." "Fine by me," Kyle muttered. "Let's pack up and get the heck out of here." Luke set his mug down and rubbed his temples. "Okay, but what's the plan? The car can only take so much gear. Do we—" "We'll figure it out," Rachel interrupted. "We'll leave the camping supplies or whatever. We just have to—" A loud, metallic clang echoed through the cabin, cutting her off. Everyone froze. "What the heck was that?" Jess whispered. "Sounded like it came from the car," Luke said, standing quickly. We all grabbed whatever we could find, flashlights, a crowbar, a broom, and headed outside. The clearing was empty, but the sound had definitely come from the direction of the parking area. When we reached the car, my stomach dropped. Both tires on the driver's side were slashed, deflated into sad, crumpled shapes against the gravel. A long, jagged tear ran down each one, as though something sharp and deliberate had ripped through them. "Jesus Christ," Jess muttered. "Not just that," Luke said, crouching near the hood. He pointed to a pool of dark liquid spreading under the car. "They cut the fuel line too." Kyle kicked at a rock, cursing under his breath. "Are you kidding me? Who the heck does this?" "The women," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "It was them. It has to be." Jess threw up her hands. "Okay, great. So now we're stranded in this awful place. What do we do now?" "We wait," Luke said firmly, standing up. "The camp leader's supposed to show up tomorrow morning." "Right, that's, 24 hours. We can survive one more night." "Or one more night?" Rachel's voice cracked. "Did you see what they were doing out there? What if they come back? What if they don't leave this time?" "We don't have a choice," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're not walking 20 miles through the woods with no cell service. We stay, and we stick together." "Or..." Jess looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she folded her arms and stared at the ground. "Fine, but I'm not just standing here like a sitting duck. We're boarding this place up." We spent the rest of the day trying to stay busy. Luke and Kyle boarded up the windows in the cabins while Jess and I gathered firewood. Rachel sat by the radio, twisting the knobs in vain, trying to pick up a signal. "We should have left yesterday," she said when I came back inside. I didn't argue. She was right. As the afternoon wore on, the unease grew worse. None of us wanted to stray too far from the cabin, but being inside felt claustrophobic. The woods seemed darker than they should have been. At one point, Jess found another bundle laying near the fire pit, this one bigger than the others, with what looked like a tuft of animal fur tied to it. We didn't touch that one. By the time the sun started to set, we were all back in the main cabin, our nerves frayed and our tempers short. "Okay," Luke said. "If they show up again, we stick to the plan. Stay together, stay inside, and don't open the door." "What if they break in?" Kyle asked, his voice unsteady. "They won't," Luke said, though he didn't sound convinced. "We'll be fine." Nobody believed him. The sky outside darkened. I could feel it in my bones. The night was coming. It started with the wind. The shutters rattled, and the trees outside groaned like they were on the verge of snapping. Luke had locked and barred the doors earlier in the evening, and we'd shoved the cabin's 2 flimsy tables against them for good measure, but none of it felt like enough. Rachel was still by the radio, twisting the knobs in a desperate, silent plea for a signal. Jess was in the corner, gripping a kitchen knife she'd dug out of the supply shed, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. Kyle sat on the floor, gripping the fire poker so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "What time is it?" Jess finally asked, breaking the silence. "Late," Luke said. He was crouched by the window, keeping an eye on the clearing through a crack in the boarded shutters. Jess laughed bitterly. "Great, super helpful. Thanks, Luke." "Cut it out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to stay calm." "Calm?" she snapped. "Did you miss the part where we're trapped in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of psycho witches who slashed our tires and cut our fuel line? You want me to calm down?" "I want you to stop freaking everyone out." Before Jess could respond, Luke held up a hand. "Quiet." We all froze, every muscle in my body locking up as I strained to hear what he did. At first, there was nothing but the wind and the groaning trees, and then I heard it, the sound I'd been dreading since the sunset. The chanting. It started faint, like it had the night before, but this time it wasn't coming from the woods. It was closer, much closer. "Jesus Christ," Rachel whispered. "They're here," Luke said, his voice flat. We crowded around the window, peeking out through the cracks. The fire pit at the center of the clearing glowed faintly with embers we thought had died hours ago. Figures moved in the shadows around it, their bodies lithe and jerky like crows being yanked on leash. They were the same women from the previous night, or whatever was left of them. Their skin hung loose and torn, the raw pink flesh underneath glistening in the firelight. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes milky and empty, but their mouths moved in a synchronized rhythm, muttering words that didn't belong to any language I'd ever heard. One of them bent backward at an impossible angle, her head lolling unnaturally to one side as her voice grew louder. Another dragged something heavy behind her, a burlap sack that squirmed and bled onto the dirt. Are those... Kyle started, but his voice trailed off, his face ashen. The women moved with purpose, dragging the sack toward the fire pit. One reached into it and pulled out a struggling, writhing animal. A rabbit, I think. The woman held it high above her head, her muttering rising to a fever pitch, and then... She ripped it open with her bare hands. Rachel let out a choked sob and stumbled back from the window, but I couldn't look away. Blood poured down the woman's arms, thick and dark, pooling at her feet. She flung the carcass into the fire, where it hissed and popped, filling the air with the sickening stench of burning flesh. The chanting grew louder, more aggressive. The other women followed suit, pulling more animals from the sack, mangled rabbits, a squirrel, something I couldn't even identify, and spilling their blood into the flames. "Stop watching," Jess hissed, grabbing my arm and yanking me back from the window. "We need to do something." "Do what?" Kyle said, his voice breaking. "What are we supposed to do against that?" "We can't just sit here," Jess snapped. "They haven't come for us yet," Luke said quietly, his eyes still glued to the window. "We stay inside. We stay quiet. Maybe they'll..." He trailed off, but we all knew how that sentence was supposed to end. Maybe they'll leave. The fire in the clearing roared higher, throwing long, flickering shadows across the trees. One of the women began to scream, not in pain, but in what sounded like triumph. Her voice was guttural, inhuman, rising above the others as she threw her arms wide and tipped her head back to the sky. The others joined in, their bodies contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Bones cracked, joints twisted, and yet they didn't stop moving. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside me, vibrating in my skull, in my chest, in the marrow of my bones. And then one of them stopped. She turned slowly, her head snapping unnaturally to one side, and stared directly at the cabin. "They know we're here," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. The woman stepped forward, her movements erratic and uneven. Another followed her, and then another. They moved toward us, their eyes gleaming white in the firelight, their mouths still muttering. "Get away from the window," Luke ordered, but I was already backing up. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, until it was deafening. I could feel it in my teeth, in my ribs, my vision blurred, and for a second I thought I might pass out. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. "They're not coming inside," Jess said, her voice trembling but defiant. "They're not..." A sharp, heavy thud against the door cut her off. We all froze, staring at the door, which buckled slightly under the impact. Another thud followed, and then another, each one louder and more violent. "They're trying to break in," Rachel whimpered. Luke grabbed the crowbar from the floor and stepped in front of the door. "Stay back," he said, his voice hard but shaking. The thudding stopped, and then, from the other side of the door, came a low, rasping voice that sounded like sandpaper against stone. "Let us in." It wasn't a question, it was a demand. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there, but my feet were rooted to the floor. "Don't move," Luke whispered. "Don't say anything." The voice came again, louder this time and closer. "Let us in." The firelight outside flickered, and I could see their shadows through the cracks in the shutters. They were everywhere, surrounding the cabin, waiting. The pounding on the door stopped. For a moment, the only sounds were our shaky breaths and the faint crackle of the fire outside. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Jess was clutching the kitchen knife like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Kyle held the fire poker, standing frozen near the window. "They're gone," Rachel whispered, though her voice shook with disbelief. "They're gone." Luke didn't move from the door. "No, they're not." As if in answer, the window behind us shattered. Glass exploded inward, and Jess screamed as something long and clawed reached through, swiping at the air. The hand, or whatever it was pale and thin, its skin sagging off the bones like wet paper. "Get back," Luke yelled, swinging the crowbar and slamming it against the frame. The creature retracted its arm with a guttural hiss. "Block it! Block the window!" Kyle shouted, grabbing a chair and slamming it against the broken pane. Before we could catch our breath, another window shattered. Then another. The sound was deafening, each break followed by the relentless muttering and scratching of those things, clawing at the cabin's defenses. "They're everywhere!" Jess screamed, backing toward the corner of the room. "Basement!" Luke shouted, pointing toward the trapdoor near the kitchen. "We can barricade ourselves down there." We scrambled for the trapdoor, Rachel practically dragging me as my legs felt like lead. Jess was already there, yanking it open and shoving the others through. "Hurry!" she yelled. Kyle went next, followed by Rachel. Luke shoved me toward the opening. "Go!" I climbed down the creaking ladder into the damp, dark basement. The air smelled like mildew and old dirt. Rachel fumbled with her flashlight, casting jagged beams of light across the low, claustrophobic space. Luke followed, slamming the trapdoor shut above him just as another crash rang out from the cabin. Something heavy landed on the floor above us, followed by the sharp scrape of claws against wood. We all huddled in the corner, our backs pressed against the cold stone wall. The room was deathly silent except for the sound of our breathing. For a moment I thought maybe we were safe. Then we heard the trapdoor creak. "No," Jess whispered, gripping the knife so tightly her hand was shaking. "No, no, no." The door groaned, the wood splintering as something heavy pressed against it. The muttering was louder now, filling the room like a dozen bell chimes. And then the trapdoor shattered. The first one dropped into the basement with a sickening crunch. Her legs bent the wrong way when she landed, but she didn't seem to notice. Her skin hung off her frame in wet, rotting folds, and her milky eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Jess lunged forward, slashing with the knife, but the hag moved unnaturally fast, twisting around her strike and slamming her to the ground. Jess screamed as claws raked across her chest, tearing through her shirt and skin like paper. "Get off her!" Kyle roared, charging forward with the fire poker. He swung hard, cracking the hag across the face, but it barely fazed her. She turned on him, her jaw unhinging to reveal jagged yellowed teeth. More of them dropped into the basement, their movements jerky and inhuman. The room filled with chaos. Screams, growls, the wet sound of flesh tearing. "Run!" Luke shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the far corner of the basement, where a narrow crawl space led into the foundations. I stumbled, nearly tripping over something soft and warm. I didn't want to look, but my eyes betrayed me. Jess lay on the floor, blood pooling beneath her as one of the hags dragged her limp body toward the trapdoor. "No!" I shouted, reaching for her, but Luke yanked me back. "She's gone," he yelled. "We have to go!" I couldn't process it, couldn't believe it. Jess, the loudest, most assertive of us, was gone. Rachel was next. As we crawled through the tight, damp tunnel, she let out a choked gasp. "No! Get off me!" I turned in time to see one of the hags clawing at her ankle, dragging her backward. Her screams were cut short as another hag appeared behind her, grabbing her hair and yanking her into the darkness. "Rachel!" I screamed, but Luke shoved me forward. "Keep moving," he hissed. The crawl space opened into a wider section of the foundation, the walls damp and crumbling. Kyle was there, clutching his arm, which hung at an unnatural angle. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "They're everywhere," he mumbled. "We can't. There's too many of them." Luke crouched beside him, shaking him by the shoulders. "Stay with me. We're going to make it!" Before Kyle could respond, a shrill, unnatural scream echoed through the foundation. The light from Rachel's discarded flashlight flickered, and I saw them. The hags poured into the space, their twisted bodies moving unnaturally fast, their claws raking the walls as they closed in. Kyle let out a ragged yell and lunged forward, swinging the fire poker with his good arm. He hit one of the creatures, but another slammed into him from the side, sending him sprawling. I didn't see what happened next. I didn't want to. Luke grabbed my hand and pulled me into a narrow crack in the foundation. We pressed ourselves into the tight space, the cold stone digging into my back. "Don't move," Luke whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of claws scraping stone and the wet, gurgling screams of our friends. The hags moved through the space, sniffing the air, their muttering filling the cracks in my skull. One of them stopped inches from our hiding spot, its head jerking toward us. I held my breath, praying it couldn't see us. It tilted its head, its hollow eyes scanning the darkness. For one horrible moment, I thought it would reach for us, but then it turned and disappeared into the shadows. The screams stopped. Luke and I stayed hidden in that crack for what felt like hours. We were too scared to move or even breathe. The scary sounds faded away, replaced by the soft sound of wind blowing through the wood. When we finally crawled out, the basement was empty. The walls were covered in blood, and the air smelled like metal and decay. Jess, Kyle, and Rachel were gone. The basement was so quiet that it made my ears ring. My legs were cramping from being wedged into the crack for so long, but I didn't dare move. Neither did Luke. I stared at the floor, trying not to look at the blood on the stone or the claw marks on the walls. My mind was broken, replaying images of Jess's limp body, Rachel's screams, and the horrible sounds of what they did to Kyle. I didn't realize I was crying until Luke touched my arm. His face was pale, dirty and sweaty, and his eyes looked empty. He didn't speak. He just pointed to the faint light coming from the broken trapdoor above. "They're gone," he mouthed, too weak to speak. I shook my head. "You don't know that," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I do," he insisted, barely audible. "Listen." I forced myself to listen. The hags' scary muttering, the scraping of their claws, the screaming. They were gone. Luke reached out slowly, testing the air. When nothing happened, he motioned for me to follow. It took all my strength to crawl out of the crack. My body felt heavy, my arms and legs trembling. The basement felt smaller, every corner soaked in death. Luke and I climbed the broken ladder and cautiously pushed the trapdoor open. The cabin was destroyed, furniture was overturned, the walls were broken, and the floor was slick with blood. I tried not to look too closely at the stains, at what was left of our friends. "Keep moving," Luke muttered, his voice hoarse. "Don't stop." We stepped into the clearing. The fire pit was still smouldering, casting long shadows across the camp. The bundles of sticks and feathers were scattered on the ground, soaked in what I hoped was water, but knew wasn't. There was no sign of the hags. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I almost cried. The pale yellow light didn't feel real, like it was a cruel trick, but the further we walked, the brighter it became. Then we heard the rumbling of a truck. It was parked just off the dirt road, an old truck with the camp's logo on the side. The camp leader's truck. Luke ran, shouting and waving his arms, but I stayed back, my legs refusing to move. I watched as the door opened and a man stepped out, his face wrinkled and weathered but human. "Jesus Christ, what happened to you kids?" the camp leader asked, his voice full of concern. Luke fell to his knees, gasping for breath. "They're dead," he said, his voice breaking. "They're all dead." The man's face fell. He rushed over to me, his hands on my shoulders, asking what happened. I couldn't answer. Luke told him everything, his words a frantic mess. The camp leader's face grew darker with every word, his eyes darting toward the woods as if he expected the hags to appear. "We're leaving," he said finally. "Now." He drove us into town where the police and paramedics were waiting. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, being wrapped in a blanket, answering questions I didn't have answers to, the way they looked at us like we were crazy. They searched the camp. They didn't find anything. No bodies, no blood, not even a single claw mark. The police said it was a trauma response, that we'd imagined things in the chaos of the night. But I know what I saw, what I heard. They're still out there. Story 3. I'm Tanner. I'm 28 years old now, but I was 20 when this happened. In 2016, something strange and scary happened on my family's property in northern New Hampshire. We owned about 200 acres of land with different types of forests and 3 big open fields. There was a hunting cabin in the corner of the southernmost field. The cabin was very isolated. The nearest road was about 8 miles down a narrow dirt path, which was just wide enough for one vehicle. My father and I used to go on a turkey hunting trip every year in mid-May. The trip lasted from Friday evening until Monday morning. When I was still in school, my dad would let me stay home from school on the Monday we returned. I cherish those memories because they gave us quality father-son time, which we didn't have much of back then. In 2016, we arrived at the cabin on Friday, May the 13th, at around 6:45 p.m. The cabin wasn't fancy, but it was ours. It had a small front porch and a single wood door that led into the main area. Inside, there was a round wooden table with 3 chairs, an old green couch, a gun rack on the wall near the door to the bunk room, and a small cooking area with cabinets and a counter. For when nature called, we had the woods or an old outhouse about 15 yards behind the cabin. When we got to the cabin, my dad's red Ford F-150 kicked up some dust on the dirt path. The sun was setting, and it always felt a little spooky at the cabin when it got dark, like someone was watching us from the trees. We started unpacking our things from the truck. As we stepped onto the porch, we noticed something strange. There were 5 large holes dug in the field near the front of the cabin. My dad joked, saying, "Those must be some huge moles." He always made light of things, no matter the situation. These holes were at least 5 feet deep and 7 feet long. It looked like something had spent a lot of time in 1 or 2 of them. maybe sleeping there. But the most bizarre thing was finding 3 severed deer legs at the foot of our cabin's front door. My dad seemed disturbed, and that made me nervous. We talked for a few minutes, trying to figure out why they were there. Maybe it was a prank, a careless hunter, or even Bigfoot. We didn't find a solid explanation. My dad decided to toss the legs a few yards into the trees, saying, "Some free food for the coyotes." We unpacked the truck, settled in, organized our hunting gear, ate dinner, set up our bunks, and talked. By 9 p.m, we decided to go to bed since we had to wake up early for hunting. The next morning, we were eager to hunt. We got ready, loaded our 20-gauge shotguns, and headed out. We had makeshift hunting blinds built years ago, about a quarter-mile apart from each other and a mile and a half from the cabin. We walked east together for about a mile and a half. It was time to split up and head to our blinds. My dad joked again, hoping he wouldn't find any more severed deer legs. I didn't find it funny. I couldn't stop thinking about the previous night. I continued walking for several minutes, my shotgun over my shoulder, trying not to think about last night. Suddenly, I stopped. I could see my blind, but something felt wrong. The air smelled bad, and everything was silent. No birds, no sounds from wildlife, not even wind. I held my breath. I took my shotgun off my shoulder and moved slowly toward the blind. As I got closer, the smell of death grew stronger. I've smelled dead animals before, so I knew what it was. I opened the door to the blind, and what I saw was horrible. I found the rest of the deer. The doe had 3 legs missing, torn off at the joints. Her back was missing its hide. Her face was disfigured like something had been chewing on it, and she had many cuts all over her body. The 4th leg was broken off and shoved down her throat. Whatever killed her wanted her to suffer. I stood there in shock, not knowing what to do. Should I remove her from the blind? Should I hunt from a different spot? Should I get my dad? I had no idea. I decided to get my dad. I ran the whole quarter-mile to his blind. I wasn't in the best shape for a 20-year-old, so I was completely out of breath when I explained what I had found. My father believed me, and we quickly went back to my blind. I was eager to show him the deer, but when we got there, the deer was gone. My father still believed me, especially when we saw drag marks on the ground leading from the blind into the forest. The tracks led in the direction of the cabin, a mile and a half away. We decided to return to the cabin just in case whatever had mutilated the deer had gone there. We kept our shotguns ready as we walked back through the forest. Suddenly my father pointed ahead and said, "Look, we saw the drag marks on the forest floor and followed them quickly until we reached the cabin." As we approached the front porch, we saw the deer's body placed at the foot of the cabin's front door. My father was getting angry, and I was growing more anxious. He handed me his shotgun and dragged the deer's body to the tree line, where he had tossed its legs the evening before. "Dad, can we just go inside?" I muttered. "I don't feel like being in the woods after all this. Something isn't right." He agreed, and we went inside for the rest of the day. It was a long afternoon. We made small talk and drank Heinekens into the evening. The buzz helped our moods. It was better than being out in the woods with whoever had butchered the deer. I don't know why we didn't leave when we found the deer's body at the cabin. Maybe we were stubborn or in denial. Maybe we thought things couldn't get worse. I don't have an answer. What does it matter now anyway? That Saturday evening my father started cooking dinner, and then we heard a low, deep squeal mixed with something that sounded like laughter. It was like a large pig was outside the cabin, laughing at us. We moved to a front window to see where the laughter was coming from, and that's when we saw him. Standing at the edge of the darkening tree line was a huge, naked man with the head of a pig. He was easily over 300 pounds. It wasn't a pig mask or a costume. It was the actual head of a pig. He had tusks, a hairless body, floppy pig ears, and the legs and hooves of a massive pig. I grabbed my binoculars from my hunting bag. When I looked at him, I saw he had human-like eyes, cold and blank, staring back at us. He wore a long grin stretching across his face, almost from ear to ear. That was the worst part, his smile. I could feel his evil intentions from that smile. I had to look away. I handed the binoculars to my father, and his reaction was the same as mine, disbelief and horror. My father watched as the creature bent down and picked something up from the ground, draping it over his shoulders. My father later told me it looked like the deer's hide that had been torn from its back. "Sick thing," my dad whispered. The pigman then slowly backed into the trees and disappeared. We quickly packed our stuff, grabbed our shotgun, and ran to the truck, keeping our eyes on the tree line. My father reached the truck first. I was just coming down the porch steps when I heard him yell, "What a joke!" When I got to the truck, I saw that all 4 tires had been slashed. How did we not notice this? When could this have happened? I asked, my voice trembling. I don't know, my dad replied. Just get back in the cabin. We hurried back inside. My father locked the door and checked all the windows. We sat down at the table and he explained our plan. We had to stay the night. It was getting darker, and an 8-mile walk to the main road was out of the question. The cabin had no electricity, so my father said we would set up our LED lanterns around the main area and bunk room. He wanted to place them near the windows to light up some of the outside too. He told me we would stay up all night with our shotguns loaded and close by, in case the pigman decided to visit us. I checked my watch. It was 10:01 p.m. A few hours had passed since we saw the pigman at the tree line. We didn't have cell phones with us. We left them at home every year to avoid distractions during the trip. Besides, there was hardly any service out there anyway. By 11:45 p.m. I checked my watch again. Nothing had happened. I decided to crack a window slightly to listen for any sounds outside. It was dead silent in the woods. There was only a slight breeze carrying that familiar bad smell. "Tanner, up now!" I woke up to my father shaking me. "What is it?" I groaned, checking my watch. It was 2 a.m. I had fallen asleep at the table. My father had stayed awake. He motioned me to a front window near the door. I got up slowly and looked out into the dark front area outside the cabin, lit by a lantern. I couldn't see what my father was trying to show me at first. He repositioned me, and then I saw him. The pigman was standing just at the edge of the lantern light. His silhouette was barely visible. He looked even bigger up close, easily over 7 feet tall. His face wasn't visible. Only the 2 white, unblinking dots of his eyes showed in the dark. I knew he was still smiling. Even in the dark, I could tell. He stood there watching us. The worst part was that he was silent. He made no noise at all. My father and I stood at the window for a solid minute, staring back at him, not wanting to back away first despite our fear. He suddenly backed away from the lantern's glow, his white glowing eyes the last to disappear. He stayed close though. We could hear him circling the cabin for about 25 minutes. He made all kinds of low grunts, squeals and chuckles. My father and I had our shotguns ready, expecting him to charge through the front door, but he didn't. His noises grew fainter and slowly stopped, and all was silent again. We sat at the table, not saying a word. I kept checking my watch. 2:45 a.m., 2:50 a.m., 3 o'clock a.m. Time was going by so slowly that I couldn't take the tension anymore. "Dad, what's the plan here?" I blurted out, standing up. "We can't just sit around and wait for it to come back." My father looked at me with a bit of annoyance. "What would you have us do?" "Tanner," he said sharply, "go running out into the dark, guns blazing, with birdshot, no less. You think that's going to do anything to this thing?" I stood there for a moment, then sat down. He was right. My dad's face softened when he saw I was scared. "Listen, son," he started. "It's important that we—" A sudden loud crash of breaking glass came from the bunk room. We grabbed our shotguns and rushed in, my father ahead of me. In the bunk room, we saw the single window on the far wall was smashed, and a softball-sized rock was on the floor, surrounded by glass shards. We stood there quietly, waiting to see what would happen next. We could hear the pigman outside the window, somewhere in the darkness. He was chuckling to himself. My father, furious, ran to the broken window, stuck the barrel of his shotgun outside, and fired a thunderous shot. The pigman began to laugh and squeal, clearly amused. We heard him rush past the window and around the left side of the cabin. "It's headed for the front door," my father shouted. I stood there, paralyzed by fear. My father rushed toward the bunk room doorway, trying to reach the main area before the pigman could get in. But just as he reached it, the pigman was violently slamming on the front door. Still standing where I was, I watched my father quickly step back into the bunk room, slam the door shut, and lock it. Just as he did this, the pigman crashed through the front door, squealing loudly. He was inside now. My father backed up until he was beside me. He looked at me. He didn't say anything, but I could see in his eyes that he was afraid, not for himself, but for me. Then, an enormous crashing sound came from the main area. It sounded like the table had been thrown across the room. More crashing, banging, and the sounds of things breaking and being torn off the walls followed. The pigman was trashing the place. We couldn't see much. We had only placed a single lantern in the bunk room, so the lack of visibility, coupled with the chaos, made our situation worse, especially knowing what was on the other side of that door. I have never been so scared in my life. When the sounds of destruction finally stopped, We both held our breath. The silence was deafening. Then we heard the pigman slowly make his way to the bunkroom door, his hooves making heavy knocking sounds on the cabin's wood floor. He stopped just on the other side of the door. We could smell his foulness, even from way back in the room. My father and I raised our shotguns and aimed them at the doorway. "The minute that door breaks in, you fire every shell you have," my father said softly. The pigman began to mumble to himself. No clear words came out, but it almost sounded like a language. Then he let out an incredibly long, high-pitched squeal. The noise gave me immediate goosebumps, and I almost dropped my gun to cover my ears. I just wanted it to stop. Finally, he did. He turned from the bunkroom door and charged back outside through the shattered front doorway, and all was silent again. We waited in the lantern light for several minutes. Both of us were too shaken to move. My father's voice broke the silence. "I'm going to check things out." Keeping his aim on the bunkroom door, he slowly moved forward. I followed this time. When he reached the door, he kept his shotgun steady in one hand and unlocked the door with the other. With a firm push, it swung open. My father quickly moved into the main area, checking every corner with his shotgun raised. I was close behind him, doing the same, mainly to feel like I was doing something. The cabin was empty. Everything was in disarray. The table was flipped over, and on the other side of the room, the couch was torn to shreds. The cabinets were torn off the wall, the windows were broken, the chairs were scattered, and there were deep tusk marks all over the walls. Together, my father and I flipped the table back over and recentered it in the middle of the room, along with the chairs. There was no fixing the front door. It was in splinters all over the floor. We sat back at the table, and I glanced at my watch, which read 3:20 a.m. That whole ordeal had only been 20 minutes in total. What a joke. There were still a couple of hours until sunrise, and I was very scared that the pigman might come back for us. But to our surprise, he didn't return. We sat at the table with our shotguns, surrounded by the wreckage, until the sun began to rise over the tops of the trees. I walked outside to the porch steps and sat down. I just wanted to feel the warmth from the rising sun for a moment. A few seconds later, my father sat down beside me. "Tanner," he said with concern in his voice, "are you all right?" I nodded slowly. "I'm never coming back here," I said. Saying that out loud broke my heart, because that land and cabin had been the home of many memories since my childhood. Hunting trips, family gatherings on weekends, hikes, and all kinds of good times. But after everything that had happened over the course of that weekend, I knew I would never come back. My father put his arm around me and gave me a tight, one-armed hug, but said nothing. He then stood up. "We'd better get going. That 8-mile walk is calling our names." That made me smile a bit. "I can't wait," I replied. We packed our things and set out into the field toward the dirt path. As we walked, a high-pitched squeal echoed from the forest and across the field. My father and I exchanged glances and kept walking. The walk to the main road took about 3 hours, but we made it in one piece. We walked along the main road until we could flag someone down and have them pull over. The man who pulled over was nice enough to let us use his cell phone to call my mum. Within half an hour, she was there to pick us up. My parents owned the land for another 3 years until 2019, when they finally sold it. We never returned to get the truck or fix the cabin. The truck was included in the asking price, and the cabin was sold as is. We never told the realtor, the buyers, or anyone else what happened that weekend, which is why I have given so few details about names and exact locations. Should we have told them everything, or at least tried to? Yes. Did we? No. Would you have? It's been over 8 years, and I've stayed quiet about what happened that spring until now. I've felt a growing urge to share my story these last few months. A big part of me wants people to know that there are things in this world that can't be explained by logic or science, and that there are dark things out there that want to harm you. So, I will leave you with this. If you ever find yourself deep in the forests of New Hampshire, especially up north, I urge you to stay vigilant and keep an eye on the tree line. He could be there, watching.